this is a normalisation process. It should not be this extraordinary that the leader of the UK goes to visit China and has got these conversations. I mean, across Europe, across the West, this is what countries' leaders do, frankly, because that is such a big economy. So I think that's one thing, is just that to resume that kind of communication that had fallen by the wayside because of domestic politics in the UK, because of Brexit, because of the pandemic, whatever it is, just to kind of resume that and to understand actually this is just what happens between countries.
It has been all smiles and handshakes in Beijing. The PM, President Xi, signalling they want a closer relationship. A return visit may now be on the cards. But what was it like behind the scenes? So I did catch up with Times Radio's political editor Anna Mikhailova, who's there with the PM, and told us more.
Number 10 and his close circle are pretty happy with how it's gone. In fact, a senior member of it told me that it couldn't have gone better in terms of how they planned it. So I think the meeting with President Xi was seen as a big success for Keir Starmer. They've definitely noted the symbolism that it was longer than planned. And I think with the Chinese, they do see that as significant. I think it went on for 3 hours in total and nearly, about 45 minutes longer than it was meant to. And what was telling, John, I mean, so he had the big bilat, then he had his lunch, then he had a tour of the Forbidden City and a meeting with the Prime Minister, Premier Li, before signing some memoranda. And after that, he came to the British residence where the business delegation was gathered. He addressed them, Peter Carl addressed them. And that's where, you could really get a sense of how they think it's going.
Yeah.
And from both the British and the Chinese side. And they were very positive. I mean, they hadn't expected the Chinese to be, I think one said they were surprised by just how many links the Chinese had with Britain, like the affinity. So they mentioned education in particular, how many of that top of President Xi's team that they met had been university educated in the UK. So that was one thing. And then when Starmer mentioned the agreement on visa-free travel for Brits and for businesses, the business delegation really applauded that. And I spoke to some of the people on the business delegation. And don't forget, some of our reporting on this has been that it's a much smaller delegation than the one David Cameron brought.
Yes.
Almost half the size. Well, two things on that. One, I mean, a senior number 10 person said that was by choice, that they could have, he said if they'd wanted 400, they could have got them, but they chose a smaller delegation to make it a bit more purposeful. They selected them specifically. And then someone from the delegation who was also, he had been on the David Cameron trip. I asked how that compared, and he said that actually on the Cameron trip, there was a lot more pomp, there was a lot more showmanship. Cameron gave a lot more speeches, and but overall, he said it felt a bit naive at the time, all the golden era trumpeting. And he said this trip felt a lot more pragmatic.
Right. So let's talk about the sort of concrete gains that the Prime Minister is naturally keen to trumpet. And he said more than once, this is ultimately really about how it benefits people back here in Britain. So Anna, how will it benefit people back here in Britain?
So they've announced the visa-free travel. So people will be able to go to China without a visa for up to 30 days. Yeah. And they see that significant both for, encouraging people-to-people links, building that relationship between the two countries, but also for things like businesses. So one example they gave was the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra has a tour planned later this year, and now they won't have to sort visas for everybody.
Yes.
So that's one of the wins. Then they've halved tariffs on whiskey from 10 to 5%. And then they've also announced there'll be more business deals tomorrow. Apparently, they've signed 14 business deals, they said tonight, but we haven't seen the details of all of them.
Yes.
So we're waiting for that. So, I think tomorrow we'll probably be seeing the details of these memorandum, these agreements they signed, and there'll be a number put on it of several hundred million benefit to the UK economy. But the bottom line, John, and this came out from both speaking to the British side, but also the Chinese side who were there tonight. This is being seen very much as a first step. So they don't want the message to be that we're back to the golden era. The Starmer side don't want that. And they said privately that in his discussions with President Xi today, he made a distinction between areas of the British economy that he was happy for the Chinese to invest in and areas that wasn't open to them, which is obviously quite a big difference to the Cameron era. And then the other thing is that they see this as the Chinese see this almost as a test of the relationship. I mean, I really got the sense that they've been pretty unhappy with the way that successive British governments have blown, as they put it, hot and cold. So it's the change in approach versus
the Prime Minister talks about stability in the relationship, doesn't he? So look, easier visa travel. Indeed, easier visa travel. There's going to be cooperation on tracking boats used on the cross-channel migrant boats and other things which are positive and not negative. But, I mean, can they also fairly be called, in their own way, still rather marginal? You say, it's just the beginning. It still, does it not, look a lot like a giant PR exercise? And I know that PR exercises are a part of international relations, but we shouldn't overstate the concrete gains here, should we?
No, I mean, I think it's clear, the UK is very much the junior partner in this. So, and that's pretty obvious, but I think the response from the businesses there certainly was a welcome one. I think the message, that constantly is being repeated is that the UK can't afford not to engage with China. Obviously, critics of this approach will say that past engagement, even of the David Cameron sort, didn't actually leave Britain better off.
Yes.
And the elephant in the room, of course, is the concerns over cyber attacks, espionage. I mean, Keir Starmer, and of course, human rights. Keir Starmer made a point of saying today that he did raise the case of Jimmy Lai with President Xi, that he did raise the issues of sanctioned MPs. But in terms of what that's delivered, we're still waiting to see if it leads to anything.
Indeed. And did he say any more about how, though, that bit of the conversation went? I mean, speaking to Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, he was saying conversations about those things, about China-Russia relations, he said they'd be brushed over, Xi would nod, and everyone would be glad just to move on.
So we asked this, and the kind of the line that was described by people who were in the room was that it wasn't just a brush past discussion on those issues of human rights and Jimmy Lai. They say that the time was spent on them in the meetings, and of course they did meet for a substantial amount of time. And then my understanding is that more time was also then spent on talking about, this issue of British key infrastructure that they do not want China to invest in, which is so I think, it doesn't sound like it brush past, but at the end of the day, John, we'll never really know because we don't get the official, we don't get the detail of these bilats usually until someone writes an autobiography of someone who was in the room and then actually reveals exactly what was said versus spin and the diplomacy going on at the time.
That's Anna Mikhailova there, our political editor, who is tracking the Prime Minister's every step on his Far East tour. Now let's welcome Cindy Yu, columnist for The Times. Hello to you, Cindy.
Evening, John.
Good to have you here, Cindy. Can you just give us your assessment of the value, as we can see it here, of this trip to Britain, to China?
Mm. So, look, John, I think Anna said that this is the first step, and I think that's the main thing to take away from this is that this is a normalization process. It should not be this extraordinary that the leader of the UK goes to visit China and has got these conversations. I mean, across Europe, across the West, this is what countries' leaders do, frankly, because that is such a big economy. So I think that's one thing, is just that to resume that kind of communication that had fallen by the
Mm.
wayside because of domestic politics in the UK, because of Brexit, because of the pandemic, whatever it is, just to kind of resume that and to understand that actually this is just what happens between countries. Secondly, you asked Anna about what material gains do we get from this, and notwithstanding the stuff that's going to come tomorrow as well. I think the point is that China can never be a silver bullet for the British economy. We're not looking for some kind of massive deal that's going to suddenly make our growth 3% and inflation 2%, and real wages continue growing again, which they haven't since the financial crisis. China can't do that. It has to be a mix of different things with the UK. At the same time, in the industries and in the areas that China is important, it can be pretty influential. So you look at the delegation that the UK has taken over this time: financial services, professional services, and these services actually, Britain has a surplus, a trade surplus with China. It makes about £10 billion in that surplus, and that surplus is growing. Then you look at the other stuff: pharmaceuticals, which China has a massive aging population, all that market can be accessed.
Mm.
You look at the premium goods economy, brands like whiskey and Brompton bikes, all of these things. So I don't think that there's going to be a whole economy impact
No.
necessarily just from China, but it is an important part of the mix, and also an important part to not burn bridges with. I think is the main thing here. So it's about a balancing act, and about picking the right fights to maximise the gains and also minimise the losses on the British side.
Yes, certainly China is, of course, a vast market. It is a huge potential source of investment. Can there be such a thing as a guiding light for policy on China beyond, look for opportunities, look for investment, keep your guard up and your eyes open, and take it as it comes?
That's a pretty good guiding light, to be honest, John. Because I think, sometimes people ask about trust with China. I don't think you can have that trust with a country like this, which is ideologically different, which is just so powerful that it has so much more leverage than the UK does in any bilateral relationship. So it's not about trust there. It's about actually keeping your eyes open and seeing what opportunities there are. I guess I would add that one guiding light is to be pragmatic, to not, think that actually to act ideologically about China because it has certain things that we don't like that it does, and therefore we can just ignore it. That's not the way forward at all. And I don't think anyone sensible really is suggesting that in any case. But sometimes there is that desire to say, why do we need to do anything with China anyway?
Yes.
And we have to move past that kind of instinct. And I think part of it for the British, part of the reason why it's so difficult is because I came across this incredible fact, John, that actually in 2005 the Chinese economy was smaller than the British economy.
Yes. Yes.
So that was just 20 years ago.
Well, indeed, and look, and the I don't know, the risk of dealing with China is so apparent at the same time, isn't it? You have to assume that influence gained by China in this country can be a potential tool of coercion, and we've got so much background to look at that. Australia bullied over COVID investigations, Lithuania over Taiwan. I read earlier, Cindy, that there have been 600 documented cases of economic pressure under Xi Jinping since 1997.
Well, Xi obviously, Xi came into power in 2012, but yes,
Yes.
I mean, under China. But I think you're right. Of course, there is going to be economic bullying. And actually, going ahead, what we've seen in the last couple of years is actually an unlocking of even more broader economic coercion methods. So, for example, with rare earths export licenses, China has shown that it's quite willing actually to activate that chokehold, and that's something that we definitely need to be aware of. And so how do we prevent that from happening is not to not trade with China, but to kind of minimize those reliance points, diversify our supply chain so that there's no single thing that is only ever coming from China. That's not really going to be possible because of the size of its economy and the position of it as a manufacturing superpower, but as much as is possible. And I also would say that part of this economic bullying is actually part of the feature of the dynamic of the global economy. If you look at the way that the US has been bullying its allies in the last few months, the problem here is a differential in power.
Yeah.
And the problem here for the UK is that we are no longer a great power, we're a middle power. So in the long run, it'd be great to get some of that economic strength back. And to do that, you're going to need countries like China to keep trading with you. In the short run, though, you can't just kind of rail against everyone because you're not as powerful anymore.
So we're
The thing to do
sorry,
is to be smart. No, sorry, John. I was just about to say the thing to do is to be smart. And this is actually what non-Western countries have been doing for years. If you go to Southeast Asia, you go to Latin America, this is what they have to do. They have to hedge, they have to balance their interests between the two great superpowers and more other superpowers as well. We are now starting to be in that position.
Right, and we're talking here about a hard-headed, practical approach of dealing with China. Does the fact that the relationship with America has, I don't know, changed in ways that are very obvious, does that alter the calculation where China's concerned?
Yeah, I mean, look, Keir Starmer explicitly tried to decline the Mark Carney Middle Powers Alliance offer when he was asked about that by the press pack. But I think behind the scenes, he probably is thinking about that. And actually, the way he is building relationships with the EU, with Australia, with India as well, with Japan, he's coming back via Japan from this China trip, which I think is quite a good move as well. I think it's important to not, as with China, it's important to not aggravate America unnecessarily, but actually behind the scenes take those actions. That means that over time you're not as reliant on them either.
All right, Cindy Yu, Times columnist, great to talk to you. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you so much.